What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Well, hello, my friends. I'm Henrik Kuto, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Weekly Spooky, where we keep that Halloween spirit alive every single week of the year. And this week is no different. I want to take a second to thank all the new listeners we've been getting. The growth has been substantial, it has been, to some extent, shocking, and most importantly, it has been very, very thrilling. So this week, we've got a special little treat for you. We've got a little bit of a, kind of a Southern fried horror story, but it's a little different from what you're used to. And I gotta admit, one of my favorite things about doing Weekly Spooky is not being afraid to be a little different, because every single week can't necessarily be gut-munching werewolves and terrifying ghosts, although often it will be. But this week's story is a little different. It involves country music. Now, before you tune out, there is no country music in the piece, but it's about that era of country music that kind of existed in the 40s, 50s, 60s, a time when show business was still kind of in its infancy. And there was a lot of mystery to show business, to what made a success. You couldn't just record a song and upload it to the internet and find your fame. You had to travel town to town, winning over the hearts and minds of men and women everywhere you went. If that was how we podcast today, I would be a little bit worried about gas mileage. So it's a great story. It's written by my good friend and collaborator, John Oak Dalton. It's a Weekly Spooky original. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And I also want to mention John Oak Dalton's first feature film as a director is now available to watch free if you're an Amazon Prime subscriber. So check out The Girl in the Crawl Space on Amazon Prime, and also get yourself a copy on DVD February 4th. But all plugs aside, let's listen to the story, and afterward, I'll hang out and we'll talk a little bit more. So enjoy a little devil's food.
The Devil Knows Three Chords by John Oak Dalton, a Weekly Spooky original.
Chester Killbuck and Bobby Lee Starr were one of the hottest bluegrass duos of the 50s and early 60s, but it all ended in a dumpster behind the Avalon Ballroom in San Francisco in 1968. Like a lot of bluegrass musicians at the time, they started in the Bluegrass Boys in the late 40s and then joined the Foggy Mountain Boys in the early 50s before setting off on their own as Killbuck and Starr. Chester and Bobby Lee couldn't have been more different, and thus made an unlikely team. Chester was married 3 or 4 times and had several kids that hated him, and several more he wouldn't admit to having and who didn't know he was their daddy. Bobby Lee was still married to his first wife, Marion, and they had a son, Johnny, who was born blind in 1946 and who Bobby Lee lived and died for. Chester followed the old ways and the old music, but Bobby Lee saw things differently when his son started playing folk music with a couple of other guys. Bobby Lee wanted to add some more Bob Dylan and Graham Parsons to their song list, but Chester said that would never get them on the Porter Wagoner show, and they would get booed out of the Grand Ole Opry. Bobby Lee got through a lot of his disagreements with Chester by bringing Johnny on the road with him when he was old enough, and Johnny became a great mandolin player in his own right. So in the same way that they wanted to leave Bill Monroe and then leave Flatt and Scruggs, Johnny wanted to forge out on his own. It was the way of things, and Bobby Lee could not deny his son. But his son still needed him. So when Johnny Starr made a deal for his own band with the Avalon Ballroom, which was the premier venue in San Francisco at the center of everything happening in 1968, he might have mentioned his dad would come and play too. The Avalon promised Killbuck and Starr top billing, and Johnny's band Lemon Dirty Fingernails second, ahead of the Stone Ponies and the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Chester was very angry with the deal, but went along with it. And as it happened, Killbuck and Starr killed it in front of all these young people who were turning on to the Bakersfield Sound and the Byrds and Dylan. And suddenly, Bobby Lee could see a future for the duo, a future beyond the long county fair tours, a future beyond waiting for someone to tap their shoulder for the Opry. Bobby Lee waited backstage for his son, who was still out talking to friends, and it was good that he was late because he found out quickly Chester was still fuming. Bobby Lee found, at the little rickety table in the dressing room, his son had left a water bottle with a note that said, "Drink me," and a plate of food with a note that said, "Eat me." It was punched out in Braille with the little stylus and slate both father and son had learned to use. Bobby Lee was drinking down the water when Chester banged the door open. Bobby Lee looked at him with a smile and a squint. "I thought you slipped off with that little gal in the front row in those short shorts," Bobby Lee said. Chester's frown deepened. "Hell, that gal had more armpit hair than I do. You couldn't tell who was the girl and who was the boys with all that long hair out there." "They loved us, Chester," Bobby Lee said. "They should love their goddamn country. Your son's a cripple and has an excuse, but the rest of them boys should be over in Vietnam fighting communism," Chester proclaimed. That killed off Bobby Lee's good feeling. "It'd be nice if you could be happy with one thing in this world," Bobby Lee muttered, but Chester wasn't listening, as usual. "That one hairy SOB that plays with Johnny has a dog he calls Roy a Cuff," Chester added. "He means that with respect, Chester," Bobby Lee said. "You don't name a hound dog after Roy a Cuff," Chester shot back. Bobby Lee shrugged. "These young folks, they got their own thing going on out here," Bobby Lee said. Chester looked at him with narrowed eyes and lit a lucky strike. "They ain't our people, Bobby Lee. Our people are in Oklahoma and Iowa and every little town between there and Nashville. This whole state could fall off into the ocean and good riddance to 'em all." Bobby Lee looked at his partner full in the face. "Johnny is my son, and he's living out here. And he's got a band he calls Lemon Dirty Fingernails. And that ain't a band name, although one word is accurate." Bobby Lee swallowed hard and began to sweat. Bobby Lee wasn't sure, but it looked like the walls were sweating too. "I didn't do what I did to end up playing to a room full of draft dodgers and drug addicts," Chester said. Bobby Lee frowned. "What did you do, Chester?" Bobby Lee thought the flowered wallpaper behind Chester was starting to bloom. Chester looked at him. "You think Robert Johnson was the only man ever met the devil at the crossroads? Blues music is in the roots of the soil, but so is country music. Those roots are even deeper. You don't think a bluegrass man could find his way to those crossroads?" Chester's normally red face, flushed with anger and drink, became even redder. "What do you think is at them crossroads?" Behind him, the flowers bloomed, black. "Do you think what career we have come from good looks and your sweet nature?" Bobby Lee watched a cold smile come across Chester's face, full of yellow teeth. And then, as Bobby Lee watched, a pair of horns began to grow out of his forehead. Chester's voice came in a hard rasp. "Let me ask you another question. You knew me back when we both lived in the Cumberland homesteads up in those mountains. When you'd know my family ever have money for a fiddle? When did you ever see me practice on one when I wasn't already good?" In answer, Bobby Lee picked up the bottle again and smashed it into Chester's face. Chester fell with a growl, and Bobby Lee was on him in a flash, choking him, and after a few moments, Chester's eyes bulged, and the horns receded, and Bobby Lee quit his work. The walls quit sweating and blooming, and Chester looked like a normal person again, and Bobby Lee realized this was going to be hard to explain. So Bobby Lee dragged Chester out the back door into an alley, and heaved him up into a dumpster, and hoped that was going to be enough. Chester was heavy, and it was slow going as the ground beneath Bobby Lee seemed to buck and heave, Bobby Lee was grateful there wasn't anyone lounging at the mouth of the alley during his work. The crowd had dispersed, and with them, the good vibes, and suddenly the Avalon was just a crumbling old building. He got back into the tiny dressing room just ahead of his son, who came in beaming. "Pops, it was quite a night," Johnny said. Bobby Lee steadied his voice. "It was. I'm proud of you," Bobby Lee said. "Where's Uncle Chester?" Bobby Lee wiped at his brow. "Oh, he found some trouble to get into, I reckon." Johnny nodded, then reached out a hand. "Pops, you're sweating and you sound funny. You drink that water I left for you?" "Sure, why?" Johnny nodded more seriously and slowly. "I'm sorry, I wanted to get back here sooner. I wanted to go on that trip with you." "What trip?" "I dosed that water, Pops. I thought we could tune in together tonight to celebrate. It looks like you started without me, but I can walk you through the rest of the way. Just remember, everybody here's a friend. This place is full of love tonight." Bobby Lee sat down hard. "You didn't eat the brownies? Cool. You eat one and I'll eat one and we'll be on this trip together. I can see things when I trip, Pops. If you can dig that." Dig was a funny word to Bobby Lee. He had dumped, not dug, a place for Chester to rest. Bobby Lee started laughing. "Pops?" Bobby Lee couldn't stop laughing all night. They got onto the Opry after all when they did a tribute show for Chester Killbuck. Bobby Lee took Johnny to Nudi's Rodeo Tailors in Hollywood and got matching rhinestone suits for the gig. Earl Scruggs showed up and played with them. Mother Maybelle Carter was there, and so was Doc Watson. Doc Watson brought his son Merle, and Scruggs brought his sons Randy and Gary, and that made it more special for Bobby Lee. Roy Acuff was the MC, and it was just as well nobody in Johnny's band mentioned they had a dog named after him. The summer of love didn't seem to last a summer even. Johnny's band got broken up by the draft after all, and then broken up for good by the Viet Cong and Dien Bien Phu. Some people said the summer of love ended with the violence at Altamont Speedway, with the Rolling Stones and the Hells Angels and everything that went down. Some people pointed to the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and some the killing of Bobby Kennedy. Some even said it ended when a hippie girl tricked Chester Killbuck into going into an alley with her, where a bunch of her friends cornered him and beat him to death for his take at the Avalon Ballroom that night. The Avalon closed just a few months later and got converted into a movie theater. The first movie they showed was The Love Bug with Dean Jones. Bobby Lee took his son on the road for a short while, but Emmylou Harris called for him to record and tour with her, and once more, Bobby Lee could not deny his son. Chester was three-quarters outlaw, but he was the one with the business sense, and Bobby Lee was the one that always got lost in the music. That is why Bobby Lee felt that if Chester made a deal, he should keep it. So Bobby Lee kept doing the circuit, the fairs and the VFWs, and the high school gyms, and if he was doing a show in a nice small town on a Sunday, somebody would always invite him back to their house for fried chicken. As the years went on, Bobby Lee began to understand more of what might have happened that night at the Avalon Ballroom, but he was never really quite sure. Because if you sing the old songs that people wanted to hear, the gospel and the hymns, you had to believe it. You had to believe it, or the audience would know. When you sang, "Will the Circle Be Broken?" you had to feel that there was a better home awaiting by and by. So if you believed in one place, it only made sense you believed in the opposite place. There had to be an opposite, just like Killbuck was the opposite of Starr. But they only worked their best together. So if Chester Killbuck had really stood at the crossroads and made a promise, it was better to keep that promise than cross your fingers and hope that none of it was real. You know, one of the reasons I like this story, I'm not a huge country music person. I don't know a ton of country music history, but one thing I do know a lot about is being creative and the bizarre nature of having any degree of success. Now, I'm not here to toot my own horn and pretend like I'm some huge show business big shot, but I make movies for a living. I direct films for a living. And now, most of these films, they don't cost much more than a used car. But they get out into the world, people get to see them. I try not to constantly berate you guys with information about my movies, but it is what I do for a living. The podcast is a fun side adventure. And when you're creative and it catches and lots of people jump on board, I've always described it as kind of feeling like voodoo. So, it's not much of a stretch to consider it a deal with the devil. So I kind of feel the main character's sense that he almost has to believe that his partner made a deal with the devil to make them so successful, because it is so confusing when you're successful. I don't know, maybe I'm just only talking about my own insecurities, but for me personally, I'm always kind of like, well, why me? Well, why me? And I hope it's because, people are very entertained by the things I do, whether it's the podcast, the movies, short films, etc., etc. I hope that they're incredibly entertained, but sometimes I feel like, is there just like a voodoo trick? Do I understand it? And most importantly, if I don't understand it, can I help losing it? That is very important and very scary when you're a creative, and that's something that this story tapped into for me and definitely made me feel a little ooky. But this one was a little bit of a change of pace. I didn't want to go with another gore fest, another monster thing. I wanted something a little different, and John definitely delivered in his own flavor. And speaking of which, I know I mentioned at the top of the show, please do check out John's latest feature film, his first ever feature film as a director, although he's a somewhat legendary B-movie scribe. This was his first film as director, and full disclosure, I produced the film, but it's available right now to watch on Amazon Prime, and it's called The Girl in the Crawlspace. It also comes out nationwide. You heard that right, nationwide in the United States of America on DVD February 4th, and I'll be talking a lot more about some stuff because another film, a film I directed, is also coming out on February 4th, but right now I want to talk about John's work. John has since then directed another film called Scarecrow County, which will be coming out hopefully by the end of the year, maybe a little sooner, maybe a little later. You can't really predict these things. I also want to say another great element of the story was it was a little on the short side, and I gotta be honest, man, this Ohio winter is really wreaking havoc on my vocal cords. I am waking up and just not feeling awesome in my throat and having to chug water all day long and drink tea to try to get it back to normal, because we've been having these dips where all of a sudden it's 21 degrees for 3 days when it was 50 degrees for 2 or 3 days. Not a lot of snow, but some serious, hefty, frigid hits. So I do appreciate the story being a little on the short side so I can give my voice a chance to rest. I also want to mention, because I've never really mentioned it on here before, we have merchandise now available at weeklyspooky.com. You can get yourself a knitted cap with the Weekly Spooky logo. You can get t-shirts, hooded sweatshirts, and much more. Go to weeklyspooky.com, and remember, anything you purchase from weeklyspooky.com goes directly to helping this podcast keep rocking and rolling. I know I said it's a side gig, but, side gigs are only side gigs until they become, big gigs. So I want the show to be very successful, and I want to make sure that I'm always completely and utterly motivated to do more episodes. Also, as we become more successful, we're going to bring in new authors, and we're going to do all kinds of exciting stuff. I'm already thinking a lot about it because we've had a great growth at our Patreon, and the Patreon helps support Weekly Spooky as well. You can find out all that information at weeklyspooky.com. I don't want to sit here for 4 minutes and just talk to you guys about ways that you can hand me money, although please, feel free to. But we've got a lot of exciting stuff going on with Weekly Spooky. Also, in February, we have 2 stories that are going to reflect Valentine's Day. So we'll have one the first week of February, and then one the second week of February, both that'll hopefully get you into a very devious, loving mood. So I think at this point, it's time to call it a night, and I hope you guys enjoyed our scary story. I hope you join us next Wednesday for yet another, because we do not miss a week here at Weekly Spooky. In fact, I don't intend to miss a week unless I am either, bitten by a werewolf or in the hospital, but not both at the same time. If I'm already a werewolf and in the hospital, then I'll just go ahead and record from my hospital bed. But anyway, my name is Henry Couto. Thank you for listening. For our wonderful producer, Dan Wilder, and for our composer, Ray Mattis, you all take care of yourself. Remember, listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. I'll talk at you later.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you're safe. Trust me.